commons is formed with those who share commitments to a just cause. The despair, trauma, warnings from wisdom of the minority world, contrasted with the majority world moments that Alude Makhali shared, of stories of solidarity and connection driven by contemporary African women and feminisms, where the double bind of patriarchy and race were centered. Careful to indicate that these are not necessarily new, what she felt they did was reveal the audaciousness that were brought anew to these struggles within hierarchies of power. Recognizing that while the institutions can and should change, when they are slow to do so, pragmatically Black women exercise their agency to craft spaces of protection, creativity. Speaking of student protests during the Fallist movements, she spoke of a brand of African feminism being fashioned, with bodies and creative methodologies that, again, cannot be claimed to be new, but that's not really the point. They were different agitations because of a relation to feminist resources mobilized with an understanding of the modern condition. Sipokazi Tau shared from her research on Black women's leadership, where Black feminist women bring discomfort, disrupt memories in spaces of inheritance. Her interest in healing drew her to lessons from the body and Black women in the academy, and of pain, humiliation, suffering, and how they can be used, how even when faced with limited scarcity, silence can be used generatively. The interest in the material was through placemaking and texture of the socio-cultural identities that emerge when those not considered a part are then a part of reimagining public spaces such as the university, claiming the authority to create collective memory, to legitimize sites for commemoration. She offered really interesting constructions of the public-private home of the institution, the public-private figure of the firstborn and the first Black woman, of trusteeship, the trusteeship of the child's sibling, and the trusteeship of education and representation. Powerful, evocative entanglements. At the end of the session, her words echoed, "Think about what we must inherit from you." Dikelede Mokoena began with a paradox and an accusation of living in the university always in transitioning times, where those who declare themselves as allies and even use the language of feminism and perhaps even write about oppression, but then enact violences on the Black woman they platform in the South African university. At another point in her discussion, she spoke of a missionary consciousness within academics who write about others for whatever claims of benevolence, civilizing, saviorship. Mokoena shared from her learnings of the partners of the killed Marikana miners and about how within the thinking and the solidarities of those women, she witnessed meta-rationalities that are perhaps not recognized in the university space. Of interest to her, and by implication to advancing critical university studies, are alternative methodologies and epistemologies to address epistemicides, humanizing work, pluriversality, and engagements with the ritual archives of cultural objects and discourses that allow us to understand African worlds. In the dialogue between the three contributors, Tate, and us as the audience, emerged the complications of solidarity, collectives, brought together through identifications of sameness, trauma, allegiance, family, and how these relations may be strained, co-opted, politically within certain conditions within the university. But what also emerged was that that need not be the dominant narrative nor practice. So I've given the most recap to those two sessions, but would be remiss not to touch briefly on the evening session. In that, we were offered an invitation to engage not only with the socio-cultural figuration of Nelson Mandela, but that relation to the figuration of a university, this one in which we're now situated, its transitioning and repurposing from its problematic past. We were asked to consider if the Transdisciplinary Institute for Mandela Studies might not be a site for provocation for critical university studies within the Eastern Cape, South Africa, and on the African continent. Crane Sudin, in almost a plea against the foreclosure of the dominant narrative of the Techno-Rational University, asked us, is this a site through which a critical vision of the world and a practice could be nurtured? Responses came from 4 academic citizens from within this institution and beyond, with Kinelwa Nato pointing to the weight of the legacy of a man of great historical significance, and then the imbalance of an institution that seemingly does not appreciate such radicalism, scholarship of history, service to the poorest of the poor. Rachel Collett discussed the visualizations of the image of Mandela, the construction of him as cosmopolitan citizen and as moral authority, in a manner appealing to neoliberalism, that is of decontextualized values rather than a complex, situated historical figure. She pointed also to the problematics that we often find in research too, of funding that which complicates, noting how this has limited public sculpture and suggesting that different renditions may allow for other possibilities of the relational rather than the singular, of that is participatory rather than fixed. Compelling was her assertion that it may be the repetition of one-dimensional narratives from ignorance that may be causing indifference to the question of the figure of Mandela in the youth of this university. Nomalanga Mkhize suggested that distrust in the interests served in sharing the story of Mandela may possibly be a root cause of the disquiet among young black academic and non-academic citizens in the figuration of Mandela for the university. Ownership, proximity, preciousness, and again trusteeship of the story of Mandela, of the black memory of him becoming a collective memory, a commons, may be about not wanting to share him with people who can never understand what he meant to black people. However, the importance of his interventions as a leader in certain moments, of intellectualizing that black intelligence, commemorating that, was perhaps something worthy of dreaming a dream that is not disrespectful, but maybe sustainable for black people. Kolelo Mkhatsu began with a sense of historical relation he had as a South African activist to Mandela in 1980s, and now how he attempts the relation as a migrant scholar to a grand figure. He spoke about the love-hate relation of people to historical figures and how they can be read by us as scholars, of differences that reveals through the immediacy of the moment, over time, and in various contexts. He suggested that tragedy may be a generative orientation from which to study Mandela, as it offers the basis of humanity, not the imposition of triumph. Also that tragedy, while it may have protagonists that feature and take center stage for a while, actually reinforces the awareness that the action continues when the hero dies, as do we. So I end with that sense of the action continuing as we turn now to the launch of a book concerned with such thickness of action. Thank you. I hope you have a good day.
Good morning to everyone. Greetings. My name is Ayanda Mlacha. Umampondo uthahla undayini ungqongqoshe uziqelekazi. And thank you so much for honoring me with this opportunity of coordinating the session for this morning. So we shall go back into a story and a little bit of a narrative before I introduce the book to you. So for those of us who were around, we could still hear fearless students singing, Gio, 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 Gio. Another one boldly standing at the back and singing as well. Wayeli soja, isoja, usolomoni. And this all started mid-October 2015 at the Wits University, a protest movement that spread across the country like a wildfire, where students felt they needed to restore the dignity of a black child and that of their parents. At this point, students had reached the peak of tolerance for the sky-high tuition fee and social injustices. They came out in numbers. They were chanting, "Fees must fall, fees must fall." A protest that would only die out when the government announces a zero fees increase for year 2016. And at the time, I was a young academic and a student at the institution with a black woman in leadership who made sure I suffered in her presence. Placards were written, "We are the future of this country and we will demand free quality education." Quality education that is decolonized, of course. Another placard would say, "In 1994, my parents were sold a dream and I'm here for my refund." Protests fled. It fled up again in 2016. Following the announcement of fee increase, classes were suspended. Running and escaping gunshots became the order of the day. Tensions on campus escalated until they reached a crisis level. It was at this point that most of us lost trust in our state. It changed the way we fundamentally viewed the world. Anxiety, depression struck in. Students were heartbroken to see that they were by themselves after all. The fantasy of the rainbow nation and its ideology, yaveske yamfiliba. Of course, this raised questions of loyalty, or rather, who do we trust in the midst of many? Looking back at the beautiful words of many who were in management of institutions, I could not hold back but to think of the former VC's words as he got into position, and I quote, he said, "This is a special moment for me as I symbolically assume the Vice-Chancellor of a university that is the alma mater of Nelson Mandela." He continued to say, "I want to apologize as the new VC to all those we have wronged and to pledge that we collectively rework towards creating a safe, student-centered, non-racial, culturally savvy, and sensitive cosmopolitan academic environment." I'm sure most of the VCs in different institutions also started their journeys with similar statements, but did they live up to that in those words? That is a big question that we all had. Students could not tolerate that the world they know and grow up in is first to tell them that nothing happened in Africa outside of the colonial experience. All they wanted was to be given a chance where they could then have an impact in their social economic reality that they inherited through the prioritization of higher education, an education that needs to respond to the needs of an African child. Again, colleagues, I want to remind you that in the agenda of 1994, transformation of education was first on the list. Naidu Prinshan also states that there was an argument made in the 90s, particularly by people in position. And these people were also of power. And at the time, they needed to think more critically about priorities of the country. And it was felt that higher education was not one of those priorities. But above all, we are happy that these lived experiences also provoked conversations that are crucial around our institutions, conversations such as the state of economy, the authenticity of Freedom Charter, the validity of the Constitution in addressing and protecting its own people, the racism that still harbors our institutions, patriarchy, inequality, outsourcing, poverty, homophobia, capitalism, seeing ourselves having to define the meaning of privilege to the ones who were privileged because they could not relate. So we needed to reiterate and redefine it for them. Also, the nation learned that when students come together for a greater cause, nothing or no one can stand before them. And I love knowing that the struggle continues because we still want to see Afrocentric universities, and not just universities situated in Africa, because there's a difference right there. higher education systems that acknowledge our different languages, that appreciate our African ideas and put them at the center of everything. One that makes it fashionable to be African and overemphasizes indigenous knowledge with African system and knowledge being core of our curriculums. With all that being said, colleagues, I want to also introduce you to our main speakers for the day and this particular session, the authors of our book called Restoring Wellbeing After Student Protests, Lessons from the hashtag Fees Must Fall and its Aftermath. So the big question you might be asking yourself at this particular moment in time is how this book features and into this colloquium, and if there's a link perhaps in a world of Techno-Rational Times. But I'll allow my fellow authors of the book, Keamogetse, Thierry, and Angelina, to take the stage. And this is a project that they've worked on for 2 years, and it's still in the making process. Because of the exhibition as well, they have received so much attention nationally and internationally. They also have a research team, and as well as they took photos and exhibitions, and on your left-hand side, you will see all the exhibitions as you move out of the venue. They also have journal articles on violence and the significance of spaces, which Thierry and the colleagues will elaborate more on. And then they've also re-looked at the contributions that students that were impacted by the Fees Must Fall are having currently. And then also the different contents, the themes is also narrated in their book. So I had a brief conversation with the colleagues here, and we also picked it up that the situation that took place in 2015-2016 did not only end at that particular 2 years or a year, but it continued because it also had psychological impact on our particular student. So fellow colleagues, I shall hand over to Thierry. All right. Thierry, over to you.
Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, colleagues. It is a pleasure and an honor to be with you here and to be amongst the greatest ears in Africa. It's truly an honor. And also with the panelists, of course. Thank you very much, Ayanda, for your introduction. Today we are going to talk about our books, our book, basically. The name of our book, we are here to launch the book, which is called Fees Must Fall and Its Aftermath, Violence, Wellbeing, and the Student Movement in South Africa. We had original goals and motivation for our book. Firstly, we needed to research and document and understand the Fees Must Fall. Also, we realized that we needed to explore and capture the legacy of trauma, mental health, and well-being of our former activists. But most importantly, it was imperative that we capture the voices of the students in the midst of the voices of the manager academics. And for us to do this, we use the photo voice method, which is participatory, close-up, and student-centered, and transformative. And as I said, our goals were, we had our goals, but you'll understand.
Thanks. Yeah, so what of course then happened, as it is with a participatory action research method, is that our goals were not the goals of our participants. The moment we started coming to them and talk to them about our ideas and what we would like to do, and also talk about photo voice and what photo voice is able to do, they, over the period of the time that we've been working together, which actually now is almost 5 years from the start, changed the goals. And the goals still had knowledge goals, of course, of wanting to understand what's happening on campuses in terms of violence. But the students also wanted to have that exposed. And they were very clear that it was unacceptable and that the impact that this violence had on well-being needed to be illustrated. They wanted to create awareness. They wanted to have policy change, so the public would need to know, government would need to know, higher education policymakers and university leaders, and they've been holding us very much accountable around making sure that their story goes out and that they continue to be part of the story going out. So actually, out of the 6 authors of the book and the 35 authors of the exhibition, it's only 3 who are here now. And Leslie at the end, there are 2 Leslies here. There's the Leslie 1 and the Leslie 2, Leslie Ngazire and Leslie Powell. Leslie is one of those students who was part of the process. The students therefore were clear that we should also collectively advocate that a change in governance takes place, that students' grievances should be taken seriously by those in power, but those in authority, before one needs to start protesting. So why do we need to actually burn a library down, you know? I mean, if in the end it's possible to do this thing, you know? Why do we need to have such agitations if fees can fall, you know? Why didn't you listen when we said it 10 years ago, 5 years ago, you know, last month, you know? And then also, because of the impact that police and security services had on the campuses to actually advocate for banning riot police and eventually destigmatize student mental health issues and make sure that student counseling and mental health services were expanded on the university campuses. So that is how I think the goals changed. Now let's talk a bit about the method before we talk about the book itself.
Thank you. Now, as our goals changed, but with the view of ensuring that our process is participatory, we did photo voice. So, what is photo voice? Photo voice is a community-based participatory research approach by which taking and discussing photos supports the process through which people identify and reflect on a particular issues relevant to their well-being. In certain instances, it also supports participants in changing their circumstances with further reflection on effects of such efforts to initiate change. From this, we see that the photo voice process is actually an inclusive process. There, first of all, we have a research team. Some faces are familiar, and that's just one is missing. That is a research team. And the second part is where we were with student activists at the University of the Western Cape in 2019, yes, September 2019. And they were workshopped on photo voice. And the third stage there, you can see that as it's also a video. Yes, yeah. I don't know whether we can play that video, but basically it is it's a mini exhibition taken at the campus, at the UWC campus. So the student activists exhibited their pictures, as some of them we have seen outside. And the fourth stage, which is the advocacy dissemination phase. It's what we are currently doing. But you can see there is Asandiswa with the cap. You can see her both on stages, the stage 4 and stage 2. She is sharing her reflections with a transformation officer at the Stellenbosch University, giving her perceptions on the effect of the student movement. So, as we can see, the process is very inclusive. And in our case, this is how we did rapid photo voice. Thierry will explain.
Yeah, so photo voice usually is done in several stages and is a process where even the data collection process can take several months, where one first introduces whoever are your participants to the idea, and then one workshops that idea together, comes up with the methodology and the questions and so on, and then there's some training on taking photos with the idea to use photos as a way of illustrating and visualizing problems in a community. And then after that, there's a coming together, almost in a kind of focus group setting, where one discusses these photos collectively and comes up with ways how to best represent that to people, to oneself, to one's community, as well as to, for example, policymakers, people in authority, and so on, who might be able to do something about it, or one tries and finds collectively ways of dealing with this. So, because South Africa is a huge country, there's a limited budget, and we didn't exactly know how many times we will be able to go back to the same students. What we were able to do is we basically compressed this process into 4 days of workshops. A first day, which was about workshopping with the group of students on the campus, the methodology and the ideas and the goals and so on, and that then usually changed the goals and changed the method a little bit. Antonio Erasmus, who's somewhere here as well, here he is, he was on the photo there, he's always come with, so he is a photo visual design professional, and so he would give workshops with the students for about 2 hours or so on the first day around ethics of taking photographs, making good photographs, and so on. And then basically the rest of the day and the evening would be around taking those photos. So the students would then go out, and in many cases they would actually go and harvest their social media accounts as well and see, like, look, that's me then, and so on. It was a very interesting process. They going into their personal archives and coming back, and the second day would then be, after one has shared already most of these pictures on a WhatsApp group, would then be about talking about these pictures. On the evening of that day, or on the third day, we'd now start to script the story of each of these photos. Usually a researcher sitting down together with a student, and the student saying it again or drafting on their own a story, and then we'll type it up and print it, and that's where the first exhibition would come from. What that required was a big research team, of course, a diverse one, because we would need to be able to establish a good report, as one says in like methodology lingo, quite fast, that there's a trust emerging quite fast. So it usually would start weeks before with emailing and WhatsApping and so on, but actually the face-to-face was this 3 to 4 days only. And so issues around trust and eventually trustworthiness, the emancipatory and advocacy goals, and the ethics of this kind of research would come up again and again as something. Maybe also part of the inclusion criteria was that the students who were part of this all identified themselves as having been part of student protests and having either observed, been victims or perpetrators of violence on campus. So go to the next one.
In terms of the book, this is a book of the experiences of violence and well-being of 35 Ismail student activists from 5 South African universities. It is also a book of the sacrifices that the student generation made for the benefit of many to be able to access higher education. The book tells the students' experiences through over 104 pictures and related narratives that contextualize the photos and explain their meanings and significance. The book is presented in a coffee table format, a very unusual format to present such a heavy subject. It is a scholarly book. There were reasons why it is a coffee table book, so that it is attractive. We don't want the book to be sitting in the library and not being used. This is part of the legacy and the memory that has, and it is peer-reviewed. It is published by the Human Sciences Research Council. And it analyzes the narratives of the activists in addition to the photos. And most importantly, it is divided into several chapters which give an overview.
Yeah, so the 13 thematic chapters, which are many more themes, of course, than what we have outside in the exhibition, about double the amount of themes, are, you could say, the empirical core, but they're not just an empirical core as in like a presentation of data, because they themselves, of course, contain analysis. The narratives are analysis, are reflections, are conceptual themselves, and then those are framed by 2 conceptual chapters, the introduction chapter and the conclusion chapter, as well as methodological chapters that just intersperse with also a foreword and an afterword that also give a little bit more context to it. So I think probably what one needs to ask now is, what does a book launch like this make at a colloquium like this? And when we came here on the first day and then on the second day we're finally able to put up and have the exhibition, there was someone who said to us like, "Oh, you brought your propaganda." and Keamo and me, we were very taken aback by this comment until we realized that, oh, this person is even more grey than me. So that was probably meant in a Marxist-Leninist sense, as you are here to disseminate information to influence public opinion, which is the kind of the positive sense of the term propaganda. More commonly known, of course, is propaganda in the sense that it's deliberate misinformation to manipulate people. Okay, and so this actually for the last 2-3 days has been on our mind, so we thought we need to make a slide on this because this person will be in the room. and think about how is this different from how we conceived our research as being activist research. And so thinking about this, we actually found, of course, quite a lot of relation insofar as that activist research is also politically involved research. And it also has advocacy goals, you know, trying to influence opinion and so on, but certainly with very emancipatory and progressive. And so maybe it's not that different from the Marxist-Leninist idea for this propaganda, the dissemination stage, but we've never thought about our work in this kind of terms. But perhaps more importantly, so how does the book, the project, and more especially the student experiences that are reflected, related to the context of universities in Techno-Rational Times.
In chapter 18, there are what we call contributions and conclusions, which are basically the analysis of students' conceptions of violence. And they read as thus. Violence is historical. Violence is part of student history and presence. That history and presence is one of struggle, a struggle against oppression, dispossession, exploitation, dehumanization, a violent struggle that connects us to our ancestors, our forebears, the previous bearers of our freedom, a struggle to achieve life, to have social mobility, a future, a livelihood.
And so what we've been trying to do is to read afresh, also with the students together, the exhibition, and came up with these different ways of conceptualizing, or how students conceptualize actually violence. And we also had to say it doesn't really matter whether in the technical sense this is actually a form of violation. This is not a form of violence, and what. I mean, we know that what we went with is more like a Wittgensteinian conception of how you define a concept, or what is how do you conceptualize something. That is the use. So how the students used the term violence, and the same thing as well. And that's our last slide when it comes to well-being and how they conceptualized well-being resources and what that then means for well-being in the context of the university.
Oh, our time is almost up. Yes. Okay. Our time is up. All right. As Thierry had said, that we took the student conceptions. So the conception of well-being is based in well-being resources. It comprises of what protects from ill-being, restores well-being, and provides an avenue for functioning and flourishing in the context of higher education. As a conception of well-being that is grounded in the reflection of South African university students, it is perhaps not surprising and quite encouraging indeed that there's a lot of Ubuntu in it. It uses well-being not as contained within the individual, but a state of being that is inextricably linked up with the well-being of others. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, colleagues, another round of applause for our... Thank you so much for that presentation. I think as you were giving the presentation, I was starting to think that I've seen and I've heard that most students would say that those or some of those student leaders who were present during the 2015-2016 Fees Must Fall were captured by the state. So maybe on another day we might need to talk to you about where are they now and what role are they doing. Are they still revolutionists? Are they still working hard to ensure that we are transforming systems? But that's a conversation for another day. Thank you so much. And then for now, we will then hear review and responses by our Miss Leslie over there, Miss Leslie Powell, and Miss Dikele D. Thank you. Over to you, colleagues.
Hi, there it's on. Good morning, everybody. So, my name is Leslie Powell, and I work at Nelson Mandela University. I work as the chair for youth unemployment, employability, and empowerment. And the focus of my research is on TVET and skills and livelihoods. So when Umnoto reached out to ask me to be a respondent to the section, I was really hesitant. I was like, well, first we're in field at the moment, so we're really busy, and this is about fees must fall. Surely you want student voices responding. Hey, Leslie? Yeah. And partly because, and also I'm not a scholar of critical higher education, so a little bit of a scary thing for me to do. And so I pretty much decided, look, this is not going to work. You got to get somebody else. But Norta had sent the PDF to me. And I'd been involved with the staff organization at Nelson Mandela University, which was in support of the Fees Must Fall movement. And so I was curious, you know, what is this book about? And there were some pictures that I saw when I opened the PDF quickly. So that evening, lying on the couch, I end up opening the book, and what a mistake that was. Because it was such a mistake, because hours later, I was still at it. So it was a late night and a tired morning the next day, and it's really you guys, all of you, it's you guys' fault. At the end of the book, Charlene, just in a prologue, or at the end anyway, she describes the book as gut-wrenching. And it is gut-wrenching. The images, the texts that go with the images, I found that I'd be looking at it and putting it down and reflecting, and looking at it and putting it down and reflecting. There are so many texts and subtexts, and there's so much nuance sitting within those quotes, some of which are spoken to, and some of which the authors didn't try to talk to. You know, in a way, this is a book that tries to ask questions, and that makes the asking of the question more important than the answering of the question, if you like. It tries to identify the right questions and put those on the table. And it takes a particular epistemological frame, if you like, for doing this. And in the book, the voices of people matter. People's positionality matters. Their experiences matter. And it emphasizes that it's only by better understanding those experiences that we will be able to better get a sense of ourselves, how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to each other, how we relate to our institutions, how our institutions relate to us, and how we relate to our planet, you know, and the interrelationship between all of those layers. And the book quotes Haraway as saying that scholars have to be answerable for what we learn how to see. And I think in a way, as scholars, we've got to be answerable also for how we've learnt how not to see. And I think these two work together. So for me, the methodology was really exciting. And I think it's a methodology we need to take on board in the humanities much more. So in our own work in skills and livelihoods, we use voice and experiences a lot because we know that we can't bring northern theory and simply stick it onto the African experience. We can't just stick it onto scholarship in the global south. It just doesn't, well, you can do it and you can probably get a publication, but it's really not that useful. And we need to begin to grow our own lenses for the way in which we see and the way in which we respond to what we're seeing. So I really want to congratulate the editors, and I want to congratulate the students who worked together on compiling the photos and on making meaning from those photos. Thierry, Angelina, Keamogetse, Antonio, Tsireletsu, Sapati, really well done on this work. I know this is not easy work. It's really hard work. It's emotionally hard work. There's emotional labor that goes with this kind of work. For those of us who are involved in the Fees Must Fall movement in our different ways, there's emotional work that's involved with engaging with this kind of work as well. So find a quiet time, get a cup of coffee, a glass of wine if you drink wine, and have a look at the book and take your time, because it's a discursive journey, it's a reflexive journey into yourself as a scholar, into your institution as a place of scholarship, and into your role as being able to push all of that forward as an individual and as a collective. But we haven't actually shown a copy of the book. Can I just hold it up?
That's not the book.
Is it not the book? Have you got a copy of the book with you?
It comes out in 10 days.
Okay.
Has come out in August.
Okay, so we've seen the e-book, but we haven't seen the print copy, and so we'll get to see the print copy, but all right. So it's a pity, though. It would have been nice just to have a physical copy in the hand to wave at people, because I wanted to encourage people to get a copy. In fact, one of the reasons I decided to do this, even though I'm not a scholar of critical higher education, was because I was kind of hoping they'd give me a copy today. So I'm really disappointed, because I thought I could wave it around and just clutch onto it, you know. So that didn't work, that moment didn't work very well. So, you know, the book captures the victories of the Fees Must Fall movement, and we can't, you were saying earlier on that people tended to proceed as if nothing was happening in Africa besides colonialism, and this work, and of course combined with many other works, it really tells a story that something is happening in Africa, and we are beginning to, we change and are changing the discourse around what we think about what might be excellence in our context and in our world, and we're beginning to frame that as we walk the journey, in a sense. It talks about the victories, but it also talks about the cost to individuals, the cost to institutions, and I found myself asking a similar question. Where are those people today? We know there are some people who ended up leaving university and not coming back. We know that there were some people who were jailed. We know that there were some people who were kicked out. We know there were some people who managed to come back. We know, but where are those people today? You know, and I formed friendships during the Fees Must Fall period with people, with students, and not all of those students are doing well today. In fact, the majority are not, actually. And so to be able to tell that story would also be an important story. But the book does what it set out to do, which is to tell its story and the story of the participants who were part of this moment. And so it creates a really good starting place to have those stories. It talks about the way in which privilege and power positions were ruptured. And there's one quote that I really that just stood out for me, and it's about the Shimals Park incident at the University of Free State, and I'll read the quote. It said, "The protest was never meant to be violent, but because when we challenge the space, we are directly confronting privilege, the white students had to defend what they hold dear, a rugby match, as it turned out, over the lives of black students and workers who are affected by violent systemic inequalities. This confronting of privilege is an ongoing struggle. It didn't start in 2015 and it didn't end in 2016, and it's not going to be one that ends in 2022 either. You know, and there's this tension that sits under the book between structure and agency. Salim talks about the continuities and the discontinuities of struggle, and I don't know, you know, you can talk about the acquiescence or the non-acquiescence at different periods, but I think it's different forms of struggle that takes place in different ways. Sometimes it's louder, sometimes it's more visible, sometimes it confronts people and it stops them from doing what they would like to do. It directly confronts privilege in a way that's uncomfortable. And other times it slips quietly, you know, it becomes a different form of struggle, a form of disengaging perhaps, a form of pulling back, a form of going quiet, a form of trying to cope in different ways. But so for me, the struggle is very much present. I work within the ETP space, like at Nelson Mandela University, which is a privileged space where we can have these dialogues about how we move forward. So I want to close off because I really want to give other Leslie a chance just to make a few comments. I want to say that so much is captured in the photos and the comments that students put to these photos. I found myself looking at the photos and reading the quotes and looking at them again, and the reflection was partly historical and part of my own journey as being a student during the state of emergency in the 80s, and with so many pictures looking so much like what we experienced in the 80s, and kind of these flashbacks of different moments in your life, you know. And then in 2016, and helping students who are struggling to breathe because of the tear gas, and you know, so you kind of float backwards and forwards historically in your mind, and the book does that for you. And so then as a staff member in the 90s, and as a student also in the 90s, and now as a staff member in the 2016s, and now as a staff member in 2022. So it takes you on this journey, and I think it forces institutions to be taken on that journey as well. And the fact that so much of what we fought for in the 80s, we're still fighting for, it's so disappointing. Keamogetse was one of the participants, and she said that she participated because it reflected her experience. And so I think it will reflect your experience, and it reflects the experiences of our students in ways that is very, very important. So thank you so much for the work. Thank you for everything you've done with respect to this book, and we can have all kinds of theoretical debates going forward. It wasn't the job of this book to do that, but it's opened the space to do that, and we must have them, you know. I want to have Leslie.
Thank you, but I was thinking for protocol, chair of the session, you said, you pointed yeah, I don't want to steal your procedure.
Well, thank you so much, and good morning to everyone. I think I would also like to express my appreciation for the invitation to be on this panel. I think, I remember when Noto, she was on our floor in the department, History and Politics, and I bumped into her there, and then she mentioned the book, and I remember at that moment, so we began to reflect on our experiences, because in 2015, so when the students actually, I mean, I was also a student at the time, but I was doing my PhD, and I happened to also participate in the march to the union buildings. But that particular march on that day, I think even as many would also acknowledge, is that the narratives and the experiences that were privileged were largely those of students from so-called Ivy League universities, and those within basically, I guess Johannesburg, the city center there. The students who managed to disrupt the experience or that dominant narrative, as if the struggle itself was solely exclusively that of Wits students, etc., were the TUT students. And I remember saying to Mnoto that it was quite exhilarating, and also, I mean, fearful, especially for me at the time. As somebody who, I think prior to that moment, you had a certain view and an argument coming from a Black consciousness, Pan-Africanist, I guess, space, student political space, whereby violence was something that we easily spoke about as a need or a necessity for transformation, right? And it was on that particular day that my thinking shifted, and it shifted largely because of the stun grenades that were shot at us, and how T2 students, in their experience of the moment, literally used to take the stun grenades and throw them back at the police. And I remember one moment when, sort of asking the other student in panic, because I'm thinking, here are these guns literally pointed at us, the stun grenades, and we were literally in front. That picture of the sister who's now a parliamentarian, she was not there when all of that mess was happening, by the way. She came later on. I just wanted to just to point that out, right? So, at that particular moment when that was happening, and I remember saying to this one student, please don't do that because you're going to agitate these people to shoot at us more, and possibly they might even use live ammunition. And I'm like, also, do you not recognize that, and I'm saying this to a T2 student, do you recognize that what you're doing is also putting my life in danger and we're on the same struggle? And then he was like, I don't care if you die. You see? And it was at that moment, it was at that moment which, for me, I was like, okay, war, I'm cool with it. I don't think, in fact, my politics around the need for war in South Africa for any form of economic transformation, perhaps we should put it aside, maybe find alternative ways of really working towards transformation in our country, that war is really not an option, because that day was very traumatic. The trauma of literally hearing the stun grenades in your brain, even when you're at home, when you're sleeping at night, days after, that stuck, and literally that shifted my perspective. And I asked myself, what are the experiences of people living in war zones daily? The fact that you hear bombs in the background and you have to live with that on a daily basis, I wonder what that is doing to them and how they... So the book itself, then when you read it and you see some of the pictures, I mean, some of the pictures are really haunting, right? So it also drives you back. Doc mentioned, so it takes you back. It takes you back to moments of reflecting on certain experiences as well. It also somewhat invites and forces you to make connections, I guess, in other spaces. But what I appreciated about this book is that, you know, the narratives from other universities or experiences of students in other universities or higher learning institutions that were not necessarily given space and privilege in the narratives in the media at the time. And I think that in itself also reminds us, they say the media is an ideological state, sort of apparatus of the state. This is what Louis Althusser mentioned, right? But then in its sense, and as much as it was telling stories of the students, it also told us sort of stories of the students, of a select form of students, right? So in that sense, the book as well sort of highlights all of these things, certain, privileges that in the struggles, not everybody is treated the same. And I think also, even that in itself, also comes up in obviously the struggles themselves, what the students were saying. For instance, the experiences of, thank you. Sorry, I've just been told 5 minutes. The students of queer students, right? Of female students in the process. I think in the very same instance also, I think what was a bit also glaring for me and also what popped up was that the majority of the the photos themselves, including the ones in the gender chapter, they seem to also be dominantly representing the stories of males. So you see a lot of male students in there as well. So that for me is a bit, it's troubling, and I think also there's something there perhaps maybe worth exploring, really focusing on for perhaps a future project, continuation of this, if there's going to be another series as well of this. Also the other thing which links up to, I guess, my interest in the work that I was doing for my own PhD, which is basically using decoloniality as a framework. And one of the questions that I'd been asking myself was, and what I tried to attempt to answer in my dissertation, was what is decoloniality, particularly from the epistemic point of view, right? What is decolonial research? What does that entail? Because now for us to really engage in that, it means we have to really think about a decolonial paradigm. So what is a decolonial paradigm? What is a decolonial research philosophy? What is decolonial epistemology, ontology? And also the ethics of doing decolonial research. And as I was reading the methodology, the section of this particular book, and particularly the photo voice, I could not help myself. And as much as the authors use transformative, which would automatically, force you to land that methodology between the transformative paradigm, I couldn't help myself to try and situate that within a decolonial framework as well, within a decolonial paradigm, because what it is doing is precisely what the students were arguing for and fighting for when they were saying the need for decolonization. And so the centering of the student voices, basically in fact, even the conceptualization process, the fact that the students were allowed to be the ones defining what the concepts were, and which basically that in itself for me challenges this idea that particularly, which is what we do as researchers, right? So you extract or you get knowledge from your participants, perhaps let's say African communities or wherever, and then this process of abstraction, which then we then say we are theorizing, but actually without acknowledging that the theories are also embedded in the thoughts and the ideas that actually were shared by the participants. So in this sense, I feel like this actually became more explicit when I was reading the methodological section, especially with saying that this is what the students conceptualized violence to be. This is what the students were conceptualizing well-being to be. So consequently, you are saying that the students or the participants are also knowledge generators, right? So they generate knowledge. They have the capacity to conceptualize. They have the capacity to theorize. And in that sense, I think there's quite amazing decolonial moment that is quite necessary for us to also sort of push forward in the different works that we're engaged in. Thank you very much. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tikeledi. I think at this point I want Mr. Leslie over there to share his perspective with us, in particular because he was part of the book, the writing and all the background work, and also at the time with the Fees Must Fall, he was a student, and also right there in front. So please, it's your turn, sir.
Amandla. Long live to the undying unity of the Fees Must Fall. Long live.
Long live.
Long live to the entire spirit of the revolutionaries of the student movement. Long live.
Long live.
Long live to the unity of the African child students. Long live.
Long live.
Long live to the unity of the solidarity of the international community. Long live.
Long live.
Forward with student well-being. Forward.
Forward.
Forward with the aftermath of this very thought-provoking book. Forward. No, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Indeed, my name is simple as that. I just realized that there is another gender with the same name next to me. Maybe just to provoke the sitting and maybe give more of a historical approach on what this book, in fact, it's all about, and give you a bit of a reflection of what this book reminds us. Because everything derived from the historical material. To my understanding, this book reflects about all events that happened through the Fees Must Fall. I'm relating you now, bit of challenging you. The history reflects that the students' unity and confrontation of campus inequalities have always been in the student formation and its unity towards a common goal. I'm raising this from the historical view, relating you back to the 1987, because of entirely the book, copying from the unity pages. It's a clear demonstration of the very same unity that was demonstrated during the 1987 class generation. Because entirely in this book, we see different types of student movement coming together to play a part. In 1987, back then, we used to have a student movement called SANSCO. This is a student movement that made efforts to transform the tertiary institutions in becoming people's campus. Back then in 1987, we found that SANSCO introduced formations such as the Committee of the People. We found that they also introduced the SRC through the hotels and floor committees and faculty councils and class committees, as well as sports and cultural committees. And these structures, they were parallel in street committees, and they were also parallel in playing their fundamental role during the people's power and democratic control of the then campuses in 1987. In 1 April 1987, SANSCO and NUSAS jointly launched a campaign calling for one man, one vote. In 2015 and 16, you had all student formation, your SASCO, your EFF, all of them. Your PASMA, your DA, your Youth League, all of them jointly, your Young Communist League. They came jointly together, going to the street demanding that it is high time we raise our voice and unite for one common goal and campaign for free quality education. And now we can relate that the actions of the 2015 and 16 going forth until we received what we want from the current government. We stood firm, we were united regardless of organization where we come from. I'll take you down a bit. It was only in 1955 in the Freedom Charter where it was clearly specified that the Freedom Charter said higher education and technical training shall be open to all. And that is a right to it. By means of state allowance, scholarship on the basis of its merit. It has always been a long time promised journey. And we have seen that our generation in 2015 was inspired by the class generation of 1976. That took it to their hands to fight against the regime that wanted to teach the black child using Afrikaans as a medium term of learning. Now we see that the unit of the then class generation of 1976, it is the very same class quality generation that emerged during the Fees Must Fall. And it is a clear indication that the strength we have as a black community, the strength we have as students, despite of color, race, and gender, is behind the unity, cohesion. Also, the impact of the Fees Must Fall, both locally and internationally. Taking you back to the book, The Aftermath, it's clear on the unity and solidarity. During the Fees Must Fall, it was on the 23rd of October 2015, where about 350 students gathered outside the South African High Court Commission in London. And majority of them, they protested using their form of expressing themselves in rallying behind the Fees Must Fall of South Africa and also supporting our struggle. It is a clear indication that even back then, when things were difficult, When things were tough for black child, when they were being exploited, when they were being oppressed, and being taught with the language that is not their mother tongue, the international community rose to support from all length and breadth of the world, be it here in Africa, be it both internationally. They rose to support and rally behind that it is unfair to treat another black child and force them to learn with the language that is not theirs. And we have seen it in 2015, in October 23, when in London, students gathered to support the Fees Must Fall campaign in the High Commission. Taking you back to the last two inputs, through the eye of the workers, it's only fair that we must also demonstrate the impact that the Fees Must Fall had played in the working class. This book spoke about us students, but we are not students aloof on our own. We were not fighting alone. Remember, in order for me to go to a class, in order for me to go to an institution of higher learning in the university, I have parents at home whom are police officers. I have parents at home whom are teachers, whom are nurses, whom are soldiers working in the army, supporting me in order for me to go to study in colleges and universities. Therefore, my struggle also is a struggle that impacts them, because of they are the very same people whom are the taxpayers of this country. They are the very same people whom are looking after us and determine what we must wear and what we must eat. That is why also in campuses and in universities, we have what we call the Student Alliance Workers Union, where we have your COSATU and other unions. And we saw to it in VETS, where in VETS, security guards were formally now employed from contracts to being permanent employees in the institution. That deserves a round of applause, colleagues. The last one, social and mental challenges of students. On this one, as I make a closing remarks, many by then required psychologists after the aftermath activities, after being brutally chased by police shooting, the rubber bullets. Students, some of them, they were chased in residences. Students, some of them, they were still preparing for the mid-year examination. The trauma that has been outlined in the book. Some students find ways during that time to create bond and to create friendship. Commonly because of, you might be having a first-year student whom was in the Fees Must Fall ground campaign with a third-year student in campus. But all along, they did not know each other. Just because there was a common factor that made us to unite on the ground, we found bond in the process of us fighting for our rights, because of our language was only one language: free education or nothing. Amandla.
All right, I guess as I'm forced also to take over the baton, I'll also call just one shot of Amandla. Amandla. All right. Colleagues, at this stage, I would like to offer us a short period of us to pose questions. We have only up until 20 past for this session, so we will now start asking the first round to raise their hands, please. Okay, I've noted one hand, second hand, third hand over there. Thank you. In that fashion, colleagues. All right. All right. Okay, Spogazi, you go first.
Thanks, Sis Ayanda. Hi, everyone. My name is Pogazi. So my question is for directed, it's more comment question. We'll see how we phrase it. Maybe the fact that we call it a question is also limiting. My point of intervention, or my query for you to engage me on, right? My point of engagement, there we go, is for Leslie the male, but of course, all other panelists, I don't know how to make the distinction, so sorry. All other panelists, of course, can engage. And I want to maybe let's start from where you end, right? And how you then show us the intersectionality of the struggle of students on campuses, and how that plays out in communities and just broader society. And I think you do that very beautifully, thank you. You then, going back again, speak about this unity of students for a common goal, right? I want to ask for you to perhaps comment a bit because of your positionality in the protest itself and the broader movement, to perhaps comment on 3 areas, but it's one question. 1 is about who's present, 2 is about the mechanics, and 3 is about the absented, and I'll explain that now. You did mention, of course, yesterday that you're not from the KZN area. I think Omosoto, I'm not sure. I'd like for you, I'd like for you to maybe comment on the relationship between masculinities that you were confronted with in the space that you were in, coming in as a migrant. 2, perhaps comment on the mechanics of protest, the culture of protest, how we protest and how it disqualifies bodies or leans on ableism for certain bodies to not be able to protest because of how we practically, how we practicalize protest, right? And so this links to the question of well-being, and if you like, by extension, mental health, about the different bodies and realities of students that are located in the bodies that we have, and the functions or the limitations of the functions of our body that don't allow us to participate in protest because of how protest or how the culture of protest has been centralized to look a particular way and to center certain bodies, right? And if you like, you can touch on the question of why this particular project recognizes gender, Dikeledi speaks to this, and why it chooses to do gender in the methodology that it chooses and the visual choice to show a particular gender, but in its discourse of that thing is that it questions the centralization of one gender. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Sfokazi. Sfokazi was very smart there. Instead of asking or saying, I have 2 questions, 3 questions, she says, and if you like. All right, next person.
Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question or 2. I have 2 questions. The first question is for everyone in the panel. Then the second question is for Leslie, the male.
Yes.
So panelists, tell me, I want to imagine that, during photo voice workshops and deliberations, for some of the students, they had to relive the moments. So what ethics of care did you take into account? Because I imagine the process must have been really, re-traumatic to the students. And then the second question, and this question stems from my experience, or the fact that I was a student during the Fees Must Fall movements at UCT. And there was an interesting phenomenon that I saw, the use of the white human shield during protest. So in the sense that black students used to put white students in front to protect themselves from being assaulted by the police. So I'm hoping if maybe Leslie the male can comment on that a bit, because I felt for me it spoke largely on how violent the protest was, but at the same time the relationship that black students felt the white student had to the police who are trying to assault them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think our third hand was over here.
Okay, thank you. I'm Hillary from Makerere University. I've listened to you very carefully, and I've noted your concentration was on fees. So the student unrest were around fees. And yet, in the provision of university education or tertiary education, there are many things which you could have been dissatisfied with. For example, equal treatment, issues to do with the provision of library services, quality of the education you are receiving. Now, and what made it really disturbing that only fees must be the issue to be tackled, leading to demonstrations, leading to death of people, and so many other things, when actually there were many problems within the education sector. And the other issue is, why did you choose to protest as a media for achieving for settling your grievances? Aren't there other means you could use in South Africa here to settle disputes? So those are the questions to which I want some.
Thank you, sir. Those are good questions. I just saw a lot of heads nodding right there. We'll take our two hands. There's one, and then the last one is going to be here at the bottom. Can you please be very brief, colleagues, just in respect of time?
I thought maybe you have some pathological hatred toward me because I was the first one to raise my hand.
Not
anyway,
today, sir, sorry.
My question is very simple. I won't jargonize it. It could go to either all of them or to Leslie, the man. Leslie, how I was doing my PhD by then at Free State. How one refrain from using those moments, student misery, to become popular and be part of this structural, embedded system of, we know what I'm talking about. How one refrain from doing that? Because in my sense, in my view, most of few individuals use those moments to gain popularity and become part of the mainstream system. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, then our last hand here in front.
Sorry. I thank you so much. Thank you for the exhibition and the book and sharing this with us today. I just wanted to shift gear a little bit and to encourage you to consider really sharing about the impact of this project in time. I know we need time for that, but there's a book, there's the article, there's the exhibitions, there's all this talk. You're doing a lot of work to shift it from being purely an academic engagement. And so the impact on transformative change is what I'm really wanting to ask about. A lot of us have concerns about the impact of research on higher education and the lack of its impact sometimes on transformative change. And I think there's a need also to talk about the elevation of ocular methods, visual methods, affective methods of engaging people, but we actually need research, knowledge to be produced about it and to enter into the discourses, like you're doing now, of those of us who research higher education. So I really look forward to that and I'd encourage it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we'll hand over now to the panel to respond in any order, colleagues. I think Thierry's got the mic.
Let's go to Leslie the male.
Leslie the male. Not yet, Leslie.
Oh, hey, I'm technologically challenged. No, thanks, colleagues. Thought-provoking questions. The first speaker, how did I make it? How did I connect? How did I, coming from the other province of our country. I'm from Northwest Province. The locations of Mafikeng, there by Vryburg, and there is another centered area called Kagisano Molopo. It's a densely rural area. Vryburg is our town where we buy cruisers. Now, it's been a challenge, but maybe just to take you through a brief history. It was a conformable journey for me because of where I was coming from at home. I've served since from tender age. I served in COSAS. In my high school also, I was the former president of learners at the tender age of COSAS. And also I had the privilege to lead in structures from district to province, leading the structures of students. So already I think at an early age I was exposed and I had the privilege to gain those strategies and tactics and method on how to lead learners, from learners to students. Now, speaking from another province, moving to the other, particularly KZN, also the issue of language in the process, isiZulu, Setswana. I think for me, it was a matter of my background where I was raised. You know, I come from a very challenged background at home, where I was raised by my grandparents. You know, a single grandmother, you know, I'm not having a father and a mother, they all passed on, and may their soul rest in peace. So I think that's what kept me going, that's what made me strong, and also the passion of wanting to lead further and also be able to be exposed to all levels of leadership positions within the Progressive Youth Alliance. But the main concept was not about positions, was about the passion that drove me. When I arrived in KZN, not knowing anybody. I had to spend my first year as a student trying to adapt with the language question, also the environment. Because when I arrived with the bus. And arriving with the bus, I had to squat in campus for registration process, not knowing anybody. So I had to build relation with security guards in the institution. I had to firstly find out where is the office of SASCO. Because of by then, we were told when we were still leading COSAS that when you go to university, you have SASCO there and SASCO will look after you. You must join SASCO and be active in SASCO. So I think maybe not moving too much from the goalpost of the book and also my role that I played there. I started being active in SASCO when I arrived in the institution of higher learning. I was exposed and eager to learn what is SASCO. And many comrades were easy to identify me from the student movement because of they knew that I was coming from COSAS. So I was traceable from the Thule house, having been known of my influence that I had at home. Because we normally meet in national conferences. So that's how my role was traced now, and I was entrenched to start playing an activism role of being a student in campus and also learning. So since from 2014, on my second year, 2015, I joined a strike of fees must fall on my second year when I arrived in campus. But it was all about the passion, it was all about the passion that drove me to learn about Marxist and Leninism, to learn about SASCO. Why are they using Marxist? Why are we protesting today? And why are we wanting fees to fall? Why are we saying free education? Where does this concept come from? Learning all these things, it was a process where I was getting in a phase of transformation and being able to relate with the language and learning the isiZulu. Even now, I can speak isiZulu. Sanborn.
Sawubona.
Now, during the process of protesting,
Thank you. Leslie?
protesting and the well-being,
Leslie, can we please just be conscious of time? Ne?
during the time of us playing a role of protesting on the grounds, the lingual of also the student movement that groomed us, we're already now familiar in terms of the radical songs that were chanted on the ground, like Mushisolo, Sabama Poisa, where we sing songs that were encouraging students to run away from police, where again we would sing songs that would encourage students to not fear police. And in all these things, we always had to go back to the drawing board. We had a room where we were planning everything. We had a planning committee in the branch of our university. We would sit there, would plan, would know the strategies and tactics that we are going to use tomorrow morning to close campus. Would share ourselves with campuses, with MSL Tan campus, Redsen campus, Steve Biko campus in Durban University of Technology. So we'd always make sure that each and every night we meet and be able to share ourselves, to say this 20 will go and disrupt MSL Tan, this 20 will go and disrupt Redsen campus, this 20 will go and disrupt Steve Biko campus, to ensure that the teaching and learning does not continue, in order for us to continue with demonstration of fees must fall on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Can you please hand over to the next Leslie for your last responses?
I'm the other Leslie. So I want to make just one comment. I started off by saying that I actually work in vocational education and training and skills and livelihoods, so this is not my space. And I wanted to just end off by reminding us that when we think about the outcomes of what we call the fees must fall struggle, but which was actually broader than fees must fall, it was for free, quality education. It spoke. We also need to remember the impact that it has had on other sectors. So a direct consequence of the increased funding to universities has been that funding from our two sectors which cater for our poorest students actually have been cut. So the TVET college sector funding has effectively been capped, and also early childhood learning, early childhood centers has been capped. And these are two spaces that affect our poorest communities. And so I want to remind the community that focuses on critical higher education that we really are talking about education in a much broader sense, that learning happens in many, many places, in our communities, in informal apprenticeships, as social skills, and some of the most important learning has happened through struggles, through the way in which students had education workshops and engaged and with literature and with ideas and spoke through that. So thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Leslie.
Leslie, the man you avoided to answer the question of the comrade, I feel like in your responses, you partly answered him at the same time. I don't know if you are conscious of that, although you tried to say that was not the reason, but then actually it seems to be. And I think, unfortunately, this tends to be a common thing that happens a lot, and which then sometimes, to a certain extent, as much as authentic struggles, are waged, sometimes they can be hijacked by people with personal interests. And I think it's unfortunate, but at the same time, again, other strides that are won, those should also be celebrated and acknowledged. And I think part of the stride is that the students managed to bring to the fore the importance of Africanization. So it was just not the decolonization, but Africanization of our curriculum as well. So the conversation also forced everybody to also rethink, I guess, the faces and the lecturers and those who are actually operating and who are employed in the university space. And I think, consequently, we have been seeing changes within the universities. Although the change is also contested, it's not so easy. I think those who are in spaces of management or leadership who are entrusted with the process of transformation, they can tell you it's actually quite difficult. In fact, in certain instances, there has been a pushback. There has been a pushback, as not just at the managerial level, but also at the, I guess, staff member level. So whereas now, because it's largely the lecturers who are now having to implement, right? So the change of curriculum, the Africanization of, I guess, whatever is being taught. So in that process, I think there are other struggles which I guess had not been spoken, or certain sabotages some of us are aware of other colleagues who don't want the change. You know, the sabotages against the colleagues who are pro the change. So these are other dynamics and wars and violences that actually continued that have not actually found space and voice and conversation or colloquializing or whatever, conferencing. So why protests and not other means to settle disputes? I think yes, certainly are. I mean, and that process also involves, and it did involve, I guess, negotiation, because the students, like as I've mentioned, just Miss Mkacha. Right. When I said she was not there, she was in the negotiation room. I just want to clarify, right? She was in the negotiation room, and I think the wonderful work, we cannot disregard that. But in the space where the bullets, where the rubber bullets, where she was not there, I just wanted to clarify, right? So that process as well was multifaceted. It wasn't just one form of protest. But I think the process itself was necessary because some of us, when I started university, I was at university, I think 2006, and since I started university, there's always every year a protest within the university about fees, and yet that continued. And I think in 2015, 2016, it had to perhaps manifest itself in that way because those voices before seemed to have not really made much of an impact.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll focus on a bit of Sipukazi's question and Sabelo's question. As part of our project, what we did was to do an evaluation of the project, the methodology, particularly for the voice and the project itself. And what we found was that the focus on ableism. The project helped the activists reflect on the tactics that they're using and the consequences of such. One great example is that there's a picture out there. Yeah, no, it's in the book. There's a picture in the book where a residence is filled with, it's a University of Venda residences, is filled with tear gas. And that residences is exclusively for students with disabilities. So the project helped them to actually reflect on the impact on others. And secondly, Sabelo, in terms of the heaviness of the project, yes. We're dealing with a subject that is very hectic, and remember, I was skeptical of opening myself up to doing the project because earlier on I did my PhD focused on the culture of violence as a mechanism to solve problems with authorities at universities. So it opened up what I was not ready to actually see, the emotions, the raw emotions. And now the project again. So I was kind of skeptical. I looked at her like, this man. But what helped us is that we are a team of diverse people, in a sense that I'm a social worker, I'm a trained social worker. Angelina is a well-being specialist. Yes, he's a politician. And so we could easily navigate that process of establishing an environment in which there is trust. And what we realized, the most important part of this project was that the student activists mentioned that they were given a platform to actually speak about their issues. And this is something that they never did because they never, ever trusted the counseling centers. Thank you.
I'm going to be super quick, Ayanda.
Thank you.
I also, so to Sabelo, you know, oftentimes when it comes to research ethics processes, we really don't really like them because they tend to be very bureaucratized and so on. But in this case, we had to actually get ethics clearance about 5 times, once from the HSRC and then from the campus universities as well in some cases that they wanted to do it again. And it was very interesting always how things were pointed out again and again around the problem about self-incrimination, about stigmatization, all these things that actually can happen in a research project like that. So apart from the way that we were trying to care for the students involved in the way we would, for example, mobilize counseling services on every campus before we go. We would inform student counseling services. We would say, look, we might send students your way. Can you please make sure that you've got somebody ready? So it required, it's so logistically intensive for the voice, administratively and so on. I mean, the HSRC is a machine administratively, and still, you know, we actually had an administrator who was almost doing nothing else than photo voice for us for almost a year. That's how much it takes. It's not something that as an individual academic you should take on. It's something that you need to do in a community of people. It's really too heavy, and it's also much richer like that. Then debriefing was also very important, both with the students and with us, and all the time going back. The 2 more things I wanted to say. So about Michelle and this, accountability. I think the important thing about PAR and photo voice as well is accountability. And I think that is also what I think as scholars in universities, we need to start becoming accountable. If you're earning R1 million on taxpayers' money, you have to be accountable. Okay, well, that's kind of like a professorial salary, I would say, nowadays, somewhere around between 500 and $1 million. Not at UWC, you get more. Yeah, so accountability. And so that's also what keeps us on our toes all the time. And the last thing is the book, Dr. Jenny Dupré sent out the book by email to everyone. So you do have it in your email box, but if you do want to have a printed copy, please send an email, make the effort, say I would like one, and then you might actually get one. No, you will definitely get one. We were actually going to bring 80 copies here, but Ukraine, no paper. Okay, so the printers got delayed. Sorry for that.
Okay. I think we were all clapping because we are all aware that there is a courier service, because those books will be couriered to us, so that's why we were clapping hands. Otherwise, colleagues, thank you so much. We will adjourn this session for today. I know Leslie, the man, really wants to attend to one more question, but I think we can do that during the tea break, and then we will also have exhibitions over there. Please note that because we are running a little bit late, we would need to be back by 10:50, please, from our tea break, because there's also an international speaker that needs to log on. Thank you so much, colleagues. Have a great tea session. Thank you.